Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday, March the 14th episode of the Scientific Governance and Risk Call with MakerDAO. I'll do the preamble again. We are enormously interested in getting as much feedback and benefiting from the insights of the people in this call as we possibly can. So if you have a question, please type it in the chat at the side. If you have a microphone, do not feel shy jumping right in and joining the discussion is welcome. Feel free to interrupt. I do it all the time, so precedent has been set. We have some tweaks to the process that we're going to be talking about today, but I'm not going to steal Stephen's thunder. So I'm going to hand it off to him, and then we can get the show on the road. Stephen?
Okay, thanks, Rich. I just want to first confirm, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome. So what I'd like to do today is firstly just kind of set the broader aspects of what an agenda would look like for this kind of meeting. We would like to split this into three parts. The first is looking at the demand and supply imbalance of DAI, which obviously means, stability fee decisions. The second part would be to look at, and this is something we'll iterate into the future, is collateral type and portfolio considerations. Basically, the consideration of new collateral types, adjustments, and sort of ramifications thereof. The third is to look at what I would like to call sort of exogenous risk, like the consideration of the protocols that we're on. Like for now, it's obviously Ethereum. How would that affect us, all the way through to things like oracles, and what we need to consider as well. So just to review, I think this encapsulates pretty much the broad spectrum of everything we need to keep in mind. Firstly, the demand and supply imbalance. The second is collateral type and portfolio considerations. And the third is exogenous risk. And given that, I think today we're going to probably focus mostly on the demand and supply imbalance. So we're going to talk about the results and the next steps to possible stability fee changes. But the one thing I'd like to do before we get there is just maybe address, or rather go back and have a look at this concept of continuous approval voting. The one thing that we have found is that there are a lot of folks out there that still don't quite have it in their head yet as to what this actually means and the use of it. And I think there's 2 points that are kind of confusing. The one is the concept of continuity and the fact that you actually have to continuously be involved. And the second one is that this isn't a representative democracy type construct where you look at a vote, and if it's going your way, you think, well, why do I need to vote? Or if it's not going your way, you think to yourself, why do I need to vote? You actually have, through your mechanism of voting, you establish value for yourself. And if you don't establish value for yourself, like our good man David Strobin says, you are then just proportionately handing it out to everyone else, and you're giving them the opportunity to do so. So let's go back and have a look at, firstly, this concept of continuity and continuous approval voting. And the way I'd like to start there is to just look at something that is the absolute edge case. In the most ideal world with no friction and everything works perfectly, all 1 million MKR should be in the voting construct at all times. That is the absolute edge case. Why? Because that means all 1 million MKR and their representative holders are continually assessing the system every single moment of the day. Obviously, pragmatically speaking, that's not possible. And because of frictions and because of different point of views, you start moving away from that edge case very quickly. And if you think about it carefully, the other edge case is that if you don't have all 1 million MKR in the voting construct, then you should have all your value in DAI. So that is the other side of the construct. Now, why am I bringing up these two edge cases? Because it's somewhere in between where we get the balance between looking after the system from a continuous point of view, having enough people in there, making sure that there is sufficient representation, but at the same time being very cognizant of the fact that this doesn't require a quorum. So let me take another step back. It is really a part of the incentive structure of the MKR token holder to be continuously involved. And if they're not continuously involved, then as I said before, they give up some of that value to other folks that are involved. The idea here is to be cognizant of this at all times and know that pragmatically, there may be times you just simply cannot vote, or there's just something that is hindering you from voting. At the same time, you might decide that the voting construct is not the safest place in the world for you right now to keep all your MKR forever. You'd rather have it in obviously your own storage facility. These frictions come in, and these frictions start playing on the idea of what you consider to be the inherent value of using MKR to vote with. If you are holding MKR and it's not in the voting construct, then it really is a case of you are of the opinion that proposals are going to be coming forward. They probably will be voted on, and you will realize that value. But in not voting, again, you give up that value to those that actually end up voting. I think the premise of this is kind of very simple. You have to always be vigilant as to what the system is doing. I think the sort of game theoretic underpinnings over here push you into a corner that is obviously unrealistic and not really pragmatic. But what it does, it pushes you into the ideal state. And if you cannot reach the ideal state, you always are trying to, challenge it. So given that, it's really important to keep in mind that an executive vote is a continuous approval vote. It always requires that particular vote that passes to always be there. If you find that the MKR is pulled out and the number of MKR holding that vote in starts diminishing, all that means is that you are creating a susceptibility to someone else voting in something new that you may not be aware of. I mean, this obviously opens up so many possibilities. For all the creative types out there, it becomes very clear that, wait a minute, why not have a messaging service that every time a new proposal comes on, it pings you on your computer or your mobile, or something that basically is available to you that always gives you an alert in terms of where the vote is and where the current construct sort of lies. So given that little monologue that I just put out right now, I think it's important to keep in mind that the incentive is for you to constantly be involved. MKR is a governance token. It is basically constructed by the very smart people that created this to ensure that you are always aware of the fact that it is a governance and therefore a voting, and therefore the value component of it is in the voting. So I want to pause there and take a breath.
You cut out a little bit there.
I think we got the gist of the conversation, though. Ashley asks
that the underlying incentives is for continuity.
Ashley, do you have a mic, don't you? Do you want to ask the question?
I was just saying, I was just wondering, like, how do you actually incentivize MKR holders to vote? Like, obviously, the way that the stability fees work, they're basically used to buy and burn MKR, which MKR hold equally in theory. So is just talking of incentives and why someone would vote with their MKR. How do you think about that?
Well, that's actually, firstly, a good question. And the answer to that is first through an education process where folks have to realize that every time a proposal comes on to the voting construct, it inherently has value that needs to be released. So if you think about this in terms of collateral types, if we bring in collateral type A, B, C, and everybody votes for it to be included, you release obviously a potential supply of DAI, which obviously has stability fees which go into buy and burn. The same thing with the same thing goes with an adjustment for a stability fee, for instance. If you see that your demand supply construct is out of kilter, there is value in voting it back into equilibrium again. So all these incentives are actually very much aligned with the MKR token holders, and the value is, firstly, it is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, everyone's going to basically see their own potential value from these proposals, but I don't think it can be denied that each proposal inherently has value. You might find that, and this is where the friction comes in, this is where the creation of liquidity comes in from the edge case. If you find that folks don't see the value of a proposal, they may change from the MKR to DAI. And that is they're basically going to start voting with their feet. As soon as you don't see the value in the proposals or the future proposals that we will have in the construct, you will be able to make a decision on the basis of that and say, yes, I want to keep my MKR in the voting construct, or no, I don't see any further value inherent in it. So the incentive is through the actual the action of voting on a proposal. The value is there.
I would be interested in seeing some kind of a larger discussion around potential incentive models, because I'm personally deeply suspicious of that. As far as I'm aware, and I'd love to be corrected, there's no prior art for a successful incentivization model for voting that didn't almost immediately lead to the collapse of whatever that system was, especially in the crypto space.
Do you have some? Sorry, Rich. Do you have some case studies where incentivization actually failed?
Let me jump in here, guys, because the thing is, what's happening here is that people are essentially fixating on voter participation without really understanding what the fundamental context around what actually matters, right? Which is security of the system and that it's governed correctly, right? And the thing is that it just you don't actually have to have voter participation isn't actually just essentially a linear gauge of, okay, this is how well the system is governed and this is how secure it is, right? Because even if you have, let's say, 30% people who are voting, you don't really know how many of them are potentially malicious voters, right? Who at any point in time could switch over the vote or something like that, right? And in general, you just can't even really you can't rely on that as a security assumption in the first place. You can't just be okay, we'll just assume that we'll have tons of voters and then things will always be great and we'll never have malicious votes, right? And we'll never have stupid votes. So fundamentally, there is, and this is how, of course, the system is designed from the bottom up, right? Fundamentally, we cannot assume that governance will actually, always vote correctly and always behave correctly, right? There has to be protection mechanisms in place to actually ensure that if something goes wrong, right, and if there is a majority of malicious voters, we're able to protect against it. And this is where the big, we get into the big topic of emergency shutdown, right? And how that, ultimately that is actually what drives the system, and that is actually the real governance model. And it becomes really clear once you look at, once you think about the actual consequences of having this MKR triggered governance, MKR triggered emergency shutdown, right? So if we put the MKR triggered emergency shutdown at 50K, for instance, that means that the only threshold of voter participation that really matters is 50K at this point, because it doesn't matter if you have someone with, let's say, half of the entire MKR supply who comes and tries to perform some sort of governance attack, as long as there's 50K active voters who can then protect and do an emergency shutdown and redeploy without the attacker's MKR stake, right? And also on the flip side, it doesn't matter if you have 50K, honest voters who are all actively voting with their 50K MKR, because you can still have an attacker come and trigger a troll emergency shutdown with just you have honest voters with 500K, right? So honest voters with half of the entire total supply. Because an attacker can still come with just 50K and trigger a troll emergency shutdown, which is the best you'll achieve with any sort of attack anyway, right? So in the end, the voting itself is not really the important. Voting is more it's almost like an oracle for the governance process, right? It's how we actually indicate to the system cryptoeconomically that this is what we've decided, but it's not the actual decision-making process, right? It's not because that will be that would just be totally useless, right? If all that mattered is who has the most votes, like who's got the biggest bags of some shitcoin and who's got the most MKR to like pump the shitcoin, it would be a total disaster, right? You wouldn't actually have any sort of intelligent governance coming out of that. On the contrary, you actually need to completely divorce the individual biases of anonymous people from sort of the direct decisions made by the governments, right? Which is where, like, this is why we use scientific governance, right? So, I mean, while there is, like, obviously it makes sense to talk about like voter incentives and like just from a theoretical perspective, but it's like it needs to be done in the context of what is it we actually want to achieve. And there's actually only really one condition, like there's really only one thing that matters for MPR governance, and that is to always have a minimum amount of active voters ready to trigger an emergency shutdown to defend against some sort of governance attack, right? So some sort of proposal that is attempted to be pushed through by an MPR majority outside of the scientific governance framework. So as long as we have this minority that's ready to defend against the governance attack, that's all we need in terms of active voters. Obviously, it's nice to go beyond that, but it's not really like, there's no cryptoeconomic risk here. There's no like fundamental flaw. It's really all a question of nice to haves beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a decent summary, and it ties into something that Stephen was talking about earlier, and it's ultimately a tragedy of the commons. And we've seen in the chat that as I think that's one of the risks that we assume from the beginning is that it's going to be the same risks that are inherent in any voting system. Is will my vote actually matter? Probably not. So why bother? Or it's already going in the direction I like, so there's no point. Or it's going so far in the direction I don't like, there's no point. And the only way that we can solve those problems outside of a new and foolproof incentivization mechanism is transparency and communication, and these calls, and getting people that are deeply engaged with the system, educated, onboarded, and interested in participating. I think it's far too early for us to be overly concerned or obsessed with the numbers that we're seeing. I'm actually kind of happy with the numbers we're seeing. As long as they improve over time, we're in a good spot. I would like to keep on moving because we have a bad habit of squeezing the risk team out of time in these calls, and that's ultimately the reason why we're here, is to hear from the risk team as well. So I want to move on to the next section. I want to talk briefly about the previous mechanisms that we just put into place for the voting system, talk a little bit about numbers, and then I'm going to hand it off to Cyrus and the risk team to give us some deeper insights. Last Friday, we had an executive vote, and that executive vote was exciting for a couple of reasons, and not as good as it could have been for a few other ones. Excuse me. The vote was ratified in 10 hours and 27 minutes, which is excellent. I think that's a good sign for the voting process in general, but Maker as well, because it shows that we have some agility here, and that's going to be a recurring theme as we have these calls. Velocity and communications are going to be significant issues that we need to optimize. There's a life cycle of the governance process that starts in a call, moves to Reddit for debate, moves into various chats or social medias, then it hits an official proposal process, then it goes into potentially a governance vote, then it goes into potentially an executive vote, and then there's a cooling off period, and there's another call to discuss those issues. So we have this life cycle that we need to optimize as much as possible so we can maintain enough agility to react to market pressures as they arise. And I think that we've seen already some improvement there. I'm excited about it. There's a post in MKR Gov, which is a subreddit that everybody in this room should be familiar with or getting familiar with. It's where we're posting summaries of the debates, summaries of these calls. Live ongoing debates, summaries of these calls, metrics around the votes that we've had, and various discussions that are directly related to governance. And this is the core group that appears to be interested in governance. So everybody here should come by and join the discussion. Did somebody post the, oh, no, I got it. I want to talk to you a bit about the apathy issue and the concern with the voters and the turnout that we've seen so far, and the reasons why I'm not super concerned about it. So we're on vote number 5, I think, over the course of a year. So it hasn't sunk into the general background of unspoken assumptions of what it means to be involved with Maker, and I think that's going to be improving over time. We're rapidly approaching the cap of number of people that can find room in these calls, and so obviously things are happening. As long as we maintain that momentum, we're in a good spot. But to set some context here, we have a total of 8,000-ish Maker holders, and if we wanted to create a Venn diagram of those 8,000 holders, we need to we have a smaller circle of holders that are interested in MakerDAO itself, the ones that are interested in MakerDAO and governance, and then after that, they have to be actively interested in participating in governance, feel that they have enough insight to contribute to the conversation, then they need to set up their portal, then they need to feel that their vote is required. And it's that last step which seems to be a blocker for a lot of our members. And the idea that we need to keep on pushing the idea that even if you're not the biggest holder in the world, and I can assure you that I was at the bottom of the list of holders that voted in the last call, last vote. A lot of small Maker voters can make a lot of large impact on the system, as Rune was alluding to previously. So even if you don't think you're going to move the needle yourself, it's extremely important that you signal your support with whatever tiny bags you might have, or signal your dissent with whatever you have. There's a huge amount of value there.
One thing I would like to add is the whole question of gas costs around voting, right? Where, like in general, I really think that for the executive vote, that's more where you have like whales and funds and so on having a big impact. But the thing is that, again, like I was just talking about, right? And it's sort of the fundamental dynamics of the governance is that the executive vote has to vote a certain way, and that's the way that the scientific governance process is already decided, right? Because if you vote in a different way, you're performing a governance attack, right? Unless there is a legitimate like governance split, in which case, anyway, you need some sort of there will be an emergency shutdown in either of these cases, and there will either be a new system or two new systems following from that, right? And as a result, like the executive vote is really a very technical thing, and it's not really very much it's not so much about decision making. Where you have decision making is in the things like the governance polls, for instance. And what's really cool is that in the future, governance polls will not even require gas at all. So as a small holder, even if you just want to cast your vote of 1 MKR, it'll be possible to do that with just like signing a message from your private key. So not actually having to like pay gas for an on-chain transaction. And that's really going to help with the dynamics of this. But really, most importantly, the way you can have the most possible impact as a small voter is to join the governance call, because in the governance call, you'll have just as much of an impact as everyone else, right? And ultimately, you'll even, as a part of that process, be dictating how the funds and the large MKR holders have to vote in the executive vote.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to remain cognizant of time, so I'm going to cut off my speechifying there. One of the things I want to do before I hand it off to Riss, though, is point out the fact or revisit the idea that we're getting super popular around these parts, and these calls are getting some notice in the media and with influencers on the Twitter sphere. So it's going to be increasingly important that we treat these as a normal meeting, as opposed to in the past where we had the luxury of just chit chats and being as dramatic as we felt we could get away with. So there's last week's call was literally there were reporters in the call, which we were happy to have with us, and a summary of the call went up less than an hour later. So there's enormous amounts of visibility on these calls. So we need to be careful about a few different things. One of those things is numbers. So we need to be careful that if we're coming up with a Google Doc or a spreadsheet that has best guess numbers in there, that we're clearly explaining to people that these are ideas and maybe not facts. I want to ensure that we don't fall into the trap of creating too much urgency where that might not actually exist. So it's an environment where we will eventually be competing to have our ideas heard and our will met. But yeah, we need to do that in a way that's beholden to the risk team. So the risk team will come up with data, they will come up with charts, and they will come up with recommendations, and then we can debate those. But we need to shy away from falling into the trap of opinionating and speechifying as much as we possibly can in these calls. I think that's it for today. That's it for the graybeard wisdom aspect of the call. So as long as we keep things business-like, while at the same time let's continue to maintain some radical transparency, because that's, I think, the core of our success in these calls is that we're not filtering things 15 times before it actually makes it to the community. We're talking about real things as they happen, straight from the people that are actually executing some of these tasks. So let's maintain that transparency, but let's not say things that are going to alarm people without context. Okay, that's it for me. Cyrus, I want to hand it off to you now. So here's some context. In the course of these calls going forward, every time that we have a call that's about demand and supply imbalance like this one is, that means that there's some issue in the risk parameters that we need to address, stability fees, or the inventory is off or something. That means that we need analysis, and we need the risk team to provide that analysis for us, fill us in on what they've been up to, and give us some suggestions about what the future should look like based on the data. And that's what Cyrus is going to be bringing to these calls. So Cyrus, I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Sure. I just want to add one thing to the what you were saying about the governance, is that just want to remind people that this is largely a work in progress, and even though the media may take something from our calls and run it as a story, for example, the governance poll that we held 2 weeks ago, where we had for example 2 options, that may not be the way that it continues to be done. We're still working on how to make it as fair and unbiased as possible, or other methodologies or statistics that we pull up. This isn't just the final way that we're doing things. We're very much working on how to be transparent, fair, decentralized, and so forth.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cyrus. That's a great reminder. The governance process that we have at MakerDAO is evolving over time. And if you've been following these last 25 calls, you'll have seen that in very slow motion as it happened. We're balancing 2 different things. We're very cognizant of the fact that what we're involved in is a very serious thing, and that we can't perform experiments on the governance process, and we can't expose every lever there is, but we want to do things as rapidly as we possibly can, still maintain stability. And that's it's a good reminder that the way that governance looks right now is not going to be the way it looks in a month or 2, because we're constantly improving with feedback.
Yeah,
right,
yep. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the DAI price. I'm going to do a quick screen share. All right, so first up we have the DAI price. This is weighted average of several different exchanges that we're following. The executive vote happened around a week ago, March 8th, and for the first few days we didn't really see much change, but eventually we saw some volume hit, and we saw a bit of an uptick from about 96 cents up to about 98.5 cents. I don't think these dollar prices really traded for much size. The DAI supply also continued to grow, but at a much slower pace than we've seen in recent weeks and months. So you can see that even though we're still growing, it's still tapering off a bit. We've also seen a small uptick in CDP wipes. That is represented by the pink bars here. So you can see in the few days leading up to the executive vote, and in the couple days leading up to today's call, we saw some, maybe a small uptick in people wiping down their CDPs. We can also, we can surmise that this is either due to expected future increases in the stability fee, or just people the current rate has pushed them to close right now. We've also seen some OTC activity that suggests speculators and traders are, entering the market, buying up DAI, also potentially trying to get ahead of expected closures of CDPs. We are also working on creating more numerical representations of this data, not just charts. That is definitely a work in progress. Looking into how we might, collect and utilize market maker inventory data, start controlling for other variables such as the ETH price. There's a lot of talk about DAI demand in relation to the market price of ETH. So we will be getting that out shortly. In terms of statistical data analysis, that's about it. I think that it's clear that DAI price hasn't quite hit $1. It's been hovering around 98.5 cents for the past 3-4 days. Our thinking internally was to just observe. The DAI price seems to be trending in the general right direction. We're seeing some good metrics in terms of CDPs, DAI supply growth, market makers. I think just waiting and seeing how it evolves could be the right decision. But depending on how the next week progresses, we could explore options of holding another governance poll, or maybe just more community discussion on social media. That's about it for the DAI price. It's going to stop for some questions.
Quick question. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the statistical data analysis. Can you talk a little bit about the degree of confidence you use in observing the linkages? If you want to go back to that other chart with the pink bars representing the collateral wipes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there was you could see leading up to, the stability fee increase X, Y, and Z. But at what point are you considering those random events versus linked and correlated or causal events?
Cyrus, can you click the ETH price and DAI supply as well so we can see those two things? That might help answer the correlation.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's part of the reason we're trying to take our time and do it right. It does require kind of evaluating past historical data, going back to stability fee increases from last August, and trying to figure out which variables exactly we want to control for. We do have a somewhat limited sample size of data. This governance process is fairly new. The data from last year is not exactly relevant to today's environment, and the 2 stability fee increases we had in February were not very illustrative in terms of how things react to stability fee. So yeah, the short answer is we don't have statistical confidence today, but it is something that we're actively researching.
And just one quick follow-up. Do you have in place a system to check basically the power of those statistical correlations, or having an a priori setup to think through what the data might show and then be thus more confident in the power of what the data are showing? And also, is that public somewhere? Are those data available publicly? Can we take a look at that somewhere, or is it just in your system somewhere?
Yeah, the data is definitely public, or will be public, whatever isn't. We do have some internal other. I'm going to post these in the chat.
I actually haven't been to this data stablecoin.science thing. Are the data downloadable from there, or is it all in chart form?
It's not downloadable from the DAI.stablecoin.
Is that a possible change coming, or is that going to be permanent?
I think I can talk to that a bit. The goal the short to midterm goal is that we will eventually have a sort of a go-to location for risk at MakerDAO, which will be public. So the idea is that anyone can dig into the data themselves, grab the data sets themselves, run their own models, attempt to, we can have some debates about which data sets we as a group feel are most valid and trustworthy. And then we'll be in a position where we can come to these calls ahead of time with our own opinions that are based on the information that's available.
So just one quick note. As far as Lev's graphs go, I shared a couple of links in the chat. I also pulled very similar data in terms of the trades that were happening on decentralized exchanges. I mean, I think we can sort of confirm a little bit with looking at trading volume, what our level of confidence is, at least in the price that we're getting. So that was one question I had was, it seems that recently the trading volume on these decentralized exchanges for ETH DAI pairs has gone down. And I was kind of curious as to like if anybody had any thoughts on that and what impact that has on our level of confidence in what the price actually is.
Yeah, I mean, volumes have been generally weak across the markets the past few days, or the past week. I think part of the increase in the DAI prices has been initiated from the OTC side, if I had to guess. I know on our side, we were seeing a bit of positive upward activity. I'm not sure how else we can, what else we could do when there's low volume across, centralized and decentralized exchanges.
So I think the most critical data point that we, or at least one of them absolutely most critical, but I think especially in the situation we're in now, it's the most critical one, is to hear from trading desks and market makers what the inventory levels are at, right? Because my impression is that while we've seen an uptick on the stablecoin science chart, for instance, it is a very superficial change that has not actually had any significant impact on like what it actually looks like in terms of, do people still too much DAI? Are they still trying to get rid of it at all costs and nobody wants to buy it and so on? So I think it would be really, really interesting to hear from, I think we've got someone from the Foundation trading desk, but then also if there's anyone else who wants to sort of share the general sentiment in terms of what their inventory looks like.
So this is Joe Quintilian. I feel like this is I'm doing all the Foundation trading desks. I feel like the market has moved up, but on light volume. It has a little bit of an effect, but I feel like my feeling is eventually we should, if we don't get further press on, we should try to do one more increase. Maybe see how it goes till Monday, Tuesday, but probably the next government meetings talk about doing another increase, because I've not seen the push forward, at least to really trades above any good trades above one or even close to really one. So that's my feeling. I have seen other OTC desks who are for size have come on the bid, so the size bids below, but we're kind of in this like 985 to 99 where I see some size going off OTC, but nothing in the 99s yet.
So in terms of the Foundation trading desk itself, have you been able to start selling off DAI, and have you seen like demand for actually buying DAI from anywhere?
I really didn't want to sell DAI below 99, so I have not sold any DAI, and I've actually come in a little bit of DAI on the buying below 97, buying in the 97s.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really, I think this kind of data is super important. And I think also, of course, a critical piece is that whenever we talk about buying and selling DAI, we have to think of it in terms of buying and selling, assuming the peg is correct, right? So like, even if a trading desk is selling DAI below $1, that doesn't actually count as them being able to sell DAI, right? Because what that means is now they're taking a loss for essentially having believed in the stability of DAI, right? So I'm wondering if there's anyone else who had the same impression that they're still unable to sell DAI around $1 and even though the stability fee has had this superficial effect on the decentralized exchanges, I wonder how it actually feels like in the deeper markets.
Lewis, are you comfortable with giving us things are better, things are worse kind of indication?
I would say things are definitely the same on our end. You know, the spot prices have moved up a bit, but you know, we're not clearing at any of these prices. Yeah, I'd say like it's pretty important we don't sort of get lured into a false sense of security here. You know, the ETH price went down a little bit, and I think that has helped die out. But our inventories are still the same. We're still overweight and need to clear some.
I'd also like to add here that I think the last couple of people were spot on to bring up volume. So this run up, you know, even without asking people stuff like this, like you can see just from the trading history on Dexus, for example, that the trading volume during the run up was pretty low. That there hasn't actually been a lot of DAI traded near $1. So if you sum up all the trades that have been near $1 on the charts, you'll see it's like a couple hundred K. It's not really meaningful amounts. So I think the fact that there's just been light volume like past couple of days means that the move is less. The spot prices you're seeing are less meaningful. So I'm not surprised to hear everyone saying this. Since we're on the topic of discussing inventory, I thought something that would be quite interesting to keep in mind is that we can. It would actually be surprisingly straightforward to come up with a system where participants in the governance discussion can actually provide proof of their holdings in a zero knowledge way if they weren't comfortable, you know, giving to the public details about their accounts or their balances, but they still wanted to be able to substantiate their claims with real data to make sure that people believe them and that they're not just like pumping their their book. I think, you know, I don't want to derail this into technical discussion now, but actually this is not a huge engineering challenge. And I think that basically if a couple of people wanted to work together for a little bit to make this happen, then it'll be pretty straightforward. And I think it'll give us a really, it'll formalize this this sharing of data, right? So instead of like having to kind of awkwardly see what people want to reveal on a call like this, we can just have somewhere where people can post these proofs on a weekly basis if they want.
I love that idea, and I don't want to lose that because it was raised in our last discussion as well, that there's ways that we can come together, or the OTC desks can come together for the benefit of everybody. So anybody in this call who has a desk, wants to be involved, please email Cyrus at makerdao.com, and he can spearhead that initiative.
So it sounds like we came up close to $1 on low volume. We're still trading below $1, and market maker inventories are flat. Nobody's been able to sell anything off. Those are the kinds of things where historically we've said would justify an increase in the stability fee. And a number of people have brought this up on the chat of, if all that is true, why are we waiting here? Why would we wait an extra week? We're still below $1. Nobody's been able to sell any DAI. ETH could very well hyperventilate from here, and if that happens, we could be in trouble. So why wouldn't we be willing to move faster and give some of these market makers some relief who are still holding significant amounts of DAI?
So I think this is a really important point, right? I mean, and I totally agree, and I'm of the opinion that, you know, like if we saw no effect, we should actually do a 4% increase as quickly as possible. I think we've seen some effect, and then with that, I think we should just go steady with 2% increases. But the thing that is more important than doing a quick increase now and kind of like trying to fix the problem as quick as possible is to ensure that we can continue to actually do, you know, intelligent and effective governance in the long run. And so what we have to also weigh this against is what the kind of like community fallout and just the general sentiment around how governance is conducted, right? And I mean, and I think a great example of that is that one of the main reasons why we are in this situation in the first place is because there were so many complaints about basically doing stability fee changes that we went back to the let's do 50 basis points because then people don't get as upset, right? And it turned out that, well, they don't get as upset, but they still don't react at all in the market, right? But I think what we have right now is a system I feel will be effective enough to deal with the current issue we're facing, regardless of what sort of the underlying magnitude ultimately is, right, and how significant the change ultimately has to be. We've definitely seen that like 2% changes have an effect, right? So if we keep doing that, like we're guaranteed that it'll work out eventually, right? And there's not an uncertainty that it could all become a big, that it could all spiral out of control.
We're running out of time again, so maybe I'd like to recap and make sure that we have action items, and I also still want to give people a chance to ask some questions. So it sounds to me like we have kind of an idea here where risk is, because their job is risk, they're taking a cautious stance. So there's an option to wait and see what happens until over the next week. Then there's more options out there potentially 2 or potentially 4. So we should consider possibly a governance vote to determine, do we wait and see, do we raise it by 2, or maybe possibly a third option. And I think that's probably a valid discussion to continue in a subreddit for this call, for the debate that's related to this call. And
yeah, well, I think it's really important. Like, I mean, I think we should really try to see if we can get consensus right now. I would say the most straightforward option is, we do a governance poll for no change or 2% increase. So is there anyone who's against that right now?
Last week, there was some discussion that it would be nice to have more options on the governance polls, so we could get a better gauge of what the community sentiment really is. That maybe if we just have 1 or 2 options, we're not capturing.
Yeah, I agree. I would like that range to be less arbitrary and more risk team driven. So have them run some numbers, come up with some evidence that says that from here to here is probably good, but beyond that is risky or something. It's super important that we stay away from opinions here, and it needs to be data driven. It's scientific governance, right? So
I mean, it would be super great to have a very elaborate and sort of evidence-based range of options, right? But it's just very important that, like you're saying, Rich, it's not like choose your own adventure. What do you want the stability to be here and holder, right? I think we should try to get that done. I mean, that is a great thing, but I don't think that we should. Like, I think it would be risky to basically say, let's block, trying to fix the peg on basically, creating some new science that we're not sure if we can do currently, right?
Could we at least add a none of the above option?
Sure. I think that we're running out of time though, and I think that's trying to make
in general
the ecosystem.
Yes, I mean, when you said 0 or 2, I mean, I think at least from my perspective, I don't think anybody disputes that we should keep it at 0. I think it's more of, do we make it 1 or 2 or half or 1.5? I don't think there's any dispute that people think we should change it.
Well, it's risky to assume there's no dispute because we're a very, very limited group of people here. Not everybody likes to speak.
Fair enough.
So
also, there's a question on how long after a stability fee increase happens that we should wait to observe. I mean, how quickly do we expect certain changes to take effect?
And really quick on that note, I brought this up to David Utrobin last week after the call, which is there's definitely some improvements I think that could probably be made to the reporting of the decentralized exchanges with respect to the bid and ask prices and where the last executions fall between them and where those actually fall with respect to volume being proposed. So if there was a way to chart that, you might get more reliable data rather than just the chart that was shown before that shows where the drift is with respect to just the execution prices, because they jump around a little bit. But if you also look at the prices where people are putting out bids and offers with various volumes, you could get a sense for what the market will bear at different rates. And that can help inform and provide more data and less time may be necessary to observe between stability fee votes or other votes.
Yeah, so the thing is, I mean, because we don't have time, there's so many dimensions to this, right? So I think there's simply no way that we would be able to come up with, get consensus around a solution right now or in the very short, in the very short term. So I think what will happen, if we created a governance vote for either, do we want to do immediately do we want to keep it steady or do we want to do a 2% increase immediately? You can vote for not making a change if you think we need, because what you're essentially doing is just saying, let's wait. Like, like obviously no one thinks that we should just keep, well, at least I assume that very few people think we should keep the interest rates at their current levels. But in terms of do we want to just press ahead with a 2% increase? Or do we want to try something more elaborate? Essentially then, like, voting to not do anything in the short run can, from there, what we can then go from there is, okay, let's do absolutely nothing or let's try something more elaborate. Like, because otherwise, if we decide right now that we want to do something more elaborate, essentially what we're deciding is we want to wait, right? Because we're not going to be able to have something ready to actually do an executive vote next week. And I definitely think there should be an option to, let's try to see if we can get an executive vote through next week, because there's still, significant imbalance.
We ran out of time, and I wanted to actually get into that towards the end of the call. But when I talked earlier about the life cycle and how we're trying to tighten up this process, so I think that this might be a good opportunity to do that. So let's we're going to have transcripts and video and audio of this call, and I'm going to make a post that's devoted to this call in MakerGov. And then we can, the subject of that post will be, what does the next governance poll look like? 0 to 1%. We'll get risk teams to come in with some suggestions, and then we'll start thinking about timing. So perhaps it's 24 hours for that post to digest. Then we'll determine what the good lifespan of a governance vote is. So perhaps it's 2 days if we get enough activity there. And then we can start tightening up this cycle so we can ensure that we have an entire iteration of governance, executive, cooling off, and then evaluation between each one of these calls. So let's make sure that this debate doesn't peter out, and that we all take a look at the discussion in Reddit so we can continue. So we have 6 minutes left. So there probably isn't a lot of time left for general Q&A, I think. If there was some interesting and topical questions in the side that somebody or the sidebar that somebody wanted to ask before it's too late, we could do that now.
I just would like to talk a little bit more about the actual process, right? I mean, because I still think, I feel like we need to really try to de-risk this whole PEG process. And one thing we did last time, right, was we made this post on the MKR.gov asking for arguments for like anything other than the 2% change, right? And then, because the thing is, we can, I think a governance poll that has a bunch of different options, with each option being sort of very obvious, like, this option is here because of this data, and this is what I'm seeing, and like, is this the data you agree with, right? Or like, so we really ask people to actually provide like an informed, like, at least be kind of like an oracle almost for the kind of data that they think is like for the kind of reality that they're seeing, right? So it's very important. It's not like, what do you feel like, right? But it's something like, what are you? Can you help us figure out what's actually going on? And I think we can do that again, right? And but also again, we can maintain that ultimately there should be an option to do an increase ASAP, so an executive vote next week. And I would say that like out of like, there are kind of like a 2% is the most obvious because this is what we've already done. 50 basis point is also like another obvious one, just because it also has the advantage of being a historical increment we've done before, right?
I agree. I think we can. It's definitely, it needs to be scientifically based, and I think that we're transitioning right now between, obviously because we don't have the historical data to give us a very clear signal about the impact of these things, that we're relying on sort of the wisdom of the crowd, but we're slowly transitioning away from that. And I'm hoping that a week or two from now, we'll have enough signal to not need to ask people what their opinions are or how they feel about things. But in this discussion that we're about to post, we'll get a recap from Risk that talks about exactly what the situation was that they're seeing. And then we can get more of the more analytical people in this call. Hopefully we'll be able to chip in with their own graphs and with their own thinking. Maybe some OTC desks as well can pitch in. And then from there, hopefully fairly quickly, we can iterate into a very valid range for a governance poll that we can start kicking off as soon as possible. All right. Unfortunately, we didn't get to a lot of questions. So we're going to do the same thing that we did last week, where we're going to take the questions that were asked in the chat, and then we're going to format those and add them to the debate for this call as well. So it'll give people an opportunity to either re-ask or to have other people engage with the questions we didn't get a chance to answer. Okay, that was actually a quite good call. I'm happy with that. We're tightening things up. Things got decided, and we have next steps, and that's always good. So we can iterate on this for next week as well. But I want to thank everybody for joining us once again. Lots of great questions, lots of great data, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the debate shakes out. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rich, for hosting the call. You're the man.
Rune Christensen, real quick, do you have an email or Twitter or something?